She had everything: the ring, the empire, the man every woman in Manhattan envied. But on the night she was supposed to celebrate the rest of her life, Celeste Ashbourne heard 4 words that turned her blood to ice. If she becomes difficult. What followed those words wasn't love. It wasn't even business. It was a death sentence, wrapped in champagne and diamond cufflinks. This is the story of a woman who smiled through her own funeral, then came back to bury the man who planned it. Stay until the end. Like this video, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The champagne was Krug, 1998, and it cost more per bottle than most people paid in monthly rent. Celeste Ashbourne knew this because she had personally approved the order 3 weeks ago, sitting at the long mahogany table in the Ashbourne Group's 42nd floor conference room, going through the gala checklist with the kind of methodical calm her mother had drilled into her since childhood. Every detail matters, Celeste. Details are how the world knows who you are. Tonight, the details were immaculate. The plaza's grand ballroom had been transformed. Cream and gold, 200 white roses in crystal vases along every table, soft string quartet music threading through conversations that smelled like old money and fresh ambition. 400 guests. Senators, CEOs, a former Secretary of State nursing his 3rd glass of something amber near the east wall. Society photographers moving like sharks between groups, catching the light on sapphires and jawlines. And at the center of all of it, Celeste. In a midnight blue gown that her stylist had flown in from Paris, dark hair swept up, the Ashbourne emerald pendant at her throat, the one her grandmother had worn at her own engagement and every major family occasion since. Celeste wore it the way soldiers wear medals, not for vanity, for armor. She was 29 years old, worth more than most nations' defense budgets, and tonight was supposed to be the best night of her life. She kept telling herself that. Adrian Vale stood across the room talking to a cluster of bankers, and even at distance, Celeste could feel the gravitational pull of him. That was always the thing about Adrian. He didn't just occupy a room, he reorganized it around himself without anyone noticing. 6'2", Italian suit, the kind of jaw that made magazine photographers want to cry with gratitude. He laughed at something one of the bankers said, and the laugh was warm and genuine sounding, and Celeste had spent almost 2 years believing that laugh was the realest thing about him. She pressed her fingers around her champagne flute and smiled at someone's wife who was complimenting her necklace. "It was my grandmother's," she said. "Thank you." She excused herself toward the bar. The thing about maintaining a public face when you are the Ashbourne heiress is that it becomes second nature so early in life that you stop noticing when you're doing it. Celeste could discuss quarterly earnings projections and ask meaningfully about someone's grandchildren and deflect a journalist's intrusive question all in the same breath without her expression ever shifting more than a few controlled degrees. It was a skill. It was survival. Her father, Thomas Ashbourne, had it too. That impenetrable social composure that looked like confidence but was really just years of practice building walls out of manners. She was standing near the back corridor, the narrow service passage that ran behind the main ballroom wall and connected the kitchen staging area to the secondary bar setup. She'd slipped through it twice earlier in the evening to avoid particularly aggressive photographers. She knew the layout. The wall there was thinner than it looked, older construction beneath the renovated facade, and the corridor itself curved slightly around the back of a private alcove that management sometimes used for small private meetings. She heard Adrian's voice before she saw where it was coming from. She stopped moving. Not because she recognized any particular tension in his tone. At first it was just the sound of him. That specific timbre, slightly lower than his public register, the voice he used when he thought no one was listening. She'd heard it once before, late at night when he thought she was asleep, taking a call he'd stepped out onto their hotel balcony to take. She hadn't thought anything of it then. She pressed herself against the service corridor wall. She didn't fully decide to listen. She just didn't move. "The amendments are in the 3rd version," Adrian was saying, "not the one her attorneys reviewed. The 3rd version has the proxy language. Once it's executed, it's clean." A second voice. She didn't recognize it. Male, older, flat, and unhurried. The voice of a man who had made many careful plans over many years. "Her legal team will flag the discrepancy during final review." Her legal team reviews what I tell them to review. A pause. Something like cloth moving, someone shifting their weight. Harmon has been managing the disclosure schedules. He knows which version gets submitted. Celeste's hand found the wall, her fingernails pressed into old plaster. Harmon. Richard Harmon. 31 years as the Ashbourne family's senior legal advisor. He had attended her 5th birthday party. He had sat with her mother in the hospital during the bad weeks before the end. He had cried, genuinely, at her mother's funeral, and Celeste had held his hand because he was family, the kind that had no blood attachment, but sometimes that made the bond stronger. She stood very still. And if she notices the discrepancy herself, she won't. Adrian's voice utterly flat. She trusts me. The older voice considered this. You sound very certain for a man whose fiancé just graduated summa cum laude from Wharton. Intelligence and trust aren't the same thing. She's smart. She's also lonely. Another pause. I've spent 22 months building this. She thinks tonight is a celebration. It's a signing ceremony. The older voice again. And in the event she becomes difficult, then we have other options. No hesitation, no visible emotion. There are people who manage those situations. That's a last resort, but it's not off the table. Celeste stopped breathing. She wasn't sure how long she stood there after the voices moved away. Long enough that the string quartet shifted to a new piece. Long enough that her champagne went warm in her hand. Long enough that the initial roaring in her ears settled into something quieter and more terrible. A silence that had weight to it. A silence that meant the world had completely rearranged itself while she stood in a service corridor in a $70,000 gown. Other options. There are people who manage those situations. She knew what that meant. She wasn't naive about the world she'd grown up in. She'd been receiving death threats from disgruntled former business partners since she was 16 years old. She knew what it meant when a certain kind of man referred to managing situations. She looked down at the champagne flute in her hand. Her fingers were completely steady. That steadiness frightened her more than anything else. The fact that her body had already gone somewhere she hadn't consciously reached yet. Someplace past shock where survival instinct took over and started working without her permission. Don't run. Don't confront. Think. Her mother's voice. Or maybe just her own, shaped by years of listening to it. Celeste turned. She walked back down the service corridor. She pushed through the discreet door at the end, stepped back into the warmth and noise and chandelier light of the grand ballroom, and she smiled at a senator's wife who caught her eye near the entrance. A real smile, or close enough that no one would know the difference. She found a passing server and swapped her warm champagne for a fresh cold glass. She found Adrian. He was just breaking away from the bankers, moving toward her with that specific smile, the one she had thought was reserved only for her, the intimate one that felt like being chosen. She watched him cross the room, and she cataloged everything she now knew about that smile, cataloged it, and filed it somewhere very cold and very locked. There you are, he said. He kissed her cheek, his hand warm at the small of her back. Your father was looking for you. I was saying hello to the Fitzgeralds, she said. How are the Morrison accounts? Solid. He searched her face briefly, the way he sometimes did. A quick scan, professional almost, checking the surface. She gave him nothing but warmth and mild champagne glow. You look extraordinary tonight. You're not so bad yourself. She touched his lapel. Her hand didn't shake. I'm going to find my father. Will you come? In a few minutes. I want to catch Langford before he leaves early. Of course. She squeezed his arm. She met his eyes. She smiled. Don't be too long. She walked away from him with her spine straight and her heart slamming against her ribs with the controlled violence of something trying to get out of a locked room. She found her father near the windows overlooking Fifth Avenue. Thomas Ashbourne, at 64, looked exactly like what he was. A man who had spent 4 decades building something large enough to outlast him and knew it. He had Celeste's same dark eyes and the kind of weathered handsomeness that money preserves if you're lucky. He was talking to someone from the state attorney's office about waterway access rights, of all things, and he looked up when Celeste appeared, and his expression went immediately to the thing fathers' faces do when they see their daughters and know, somehow, that something is wrong. She touched his arm. Dad, can I steal you for about 90 seconds? He excused himself smoothly. They moved to a quieter corner near a marble column, and Celeste turned her back to the room and said, very quietly, "I need you to not react to what I'm about to tell you." He went very still. "Celeste, I'm fine. I need you to look like you're laughing at something I just said." He produced a convincing social chuckle. His eyes did not change. "Talk." She told him, quickly, stripped down to the essential facts. The corridor, Adrian's voice, the proxy language in the third version of the prenuptial agreement, Harmon's name, other options. She said it all in under a minute, the way her father had taught her to brief executive decisions, and when she finished, she watched his face do a very careful, very controlled journey through horror and arrive at something hard and cold on the other side. "Richard," he said. "Don't call him tonight," she said immediately. "Don't change anything. Don't confront Adrian. I need you to act normal for the next 2 hours, and then I need you to go home and not speak to anyone in the legal division until I tell you it's safe." Thomas Ashbourne looked at his daughter for a long moment. She could see him recalibrating, the father part of him wanting to put himself between her and something dangerous, the businessman part of him recognizing that she was right. That reaction was exactly what Adrian would be watching for. Any deviation from the expected script tonight would signal that something had changed. "You heard him say Richard's name specifically." "Yes." "And the proxy language. I know what proxy voting rights mean, Dad." She held his gaze. "He's been building this for nearly 2 years. He knows our entire operation, which means we can't use anyone inside our circle until we know who else might be compromised." Her father looked out at the room, at Adrian, still talking to Langford near the east wall, loose and easy and laughing. Thomas Ashbourne had built an empire on his ability to read people. He looked at the man who had almost become his son-in-law, and she watched something die quietly in her father's eyes. "Okay," he said. Quiet, controlled. "What do you need? Right now. I need you to go back to that conversation about waterway rights and look like nothing happened." She straightened his tie, a small gesture that anyone watching would read as affection. "I'll handle the rest." She spent the remaining 90 minutes of the gala doing the best performance of her life. She danced with Adrian, once, slowly, his hand at her waist, her cheek almost against his jaw, and she breathed carefully and evenly and thought about architecture, the load-bearing walls of the situation, what could be removed and what would bring the whole structure down. She toasted with her father. She laughed with the senator. She accepted congratulations on her engagement with expressions of genuine-seeming happiness that she assembled from pure muscle memory. And underneath all of it, one thought, circling steady and cold as a satellite in low orbit. He said, "If she becomes difficult, there are people who manage those situations." He meant her. He meant killing her. When the gala finally wound down at midnight, Celeste kissed Adrian's cheek at the elevator. "I'm exhausted," she said. "Headache. I'm going to go straight home." He looked at her. That quick scan again. She was ready for it. "I'll come with you," he said. "Stay. Finish networking." She pressed her fingers to his chest once, light and affectionate. "You've been working Langford all night. Close it. I'll see you tomorrow." He smiled. "You sure?" "I'm sure." She stepped into the elevator. She watched the doors close on his face, that face she'd spent 22 months learning to love. And she exhaled through her nose and stood very straight and stared at the brass elevator doors all the way down to the lobby. In the town car going home, she sat in the dark and did not cry. She wasn't sure if that was strength or if some circuit had simply blown somewhere important, some fuse that connected her to normal human response. She felt very far away from herself and very precisely located at the same time, which was a contradictory sensation she had no language for. She knew 3 things with certainty. First, she could not trust anyone inside the Ashbourne legal circle until she knew the full scope of what Harmon had shared. Second, Adrian was not acting alone. The older voice in that corridor, flat, unhurried, the voice of a man who arranged things, meant infrastructure, an organization of some kind, people. Third, she had approximately 2 weeks before the revised prenuptial agreement was scheduled for final signature. 2 weeks to dismantle something that had taken 2 years to build. The town car turned onto her street. The Ashbourne estate was lit at the front, warm and orderly and familiar. and Celeste looked at it through the window, and for a moment it looked like something she had never seen before, like a place she was seeing from outside for the first time, from the perspective of someone who understood now what it represented to the wrong people. Her home, her family's legacy. 4 generations of early mornings and hard decisions and an absolute refusal to let any of it fall. She went inside. She thanked her driver. She walked through the front hall and up the stairs and into her study. Not her bedroom, her study. And she closed the door and sat at her desk and opened her laptop. She did not search for divorce attorneys or financial forensics firms. She was smarter than that. She knew that any search conducted on a device connected to her regular network was potentially visible to someone. She took out the small personal phone she kept for private communications. The one Adrian had never asked about because he'd never known it existed, a leftover habit from her early 20s when she'd learned the hard way that privacy was something you built on purpose or you didn't have it at all. She opened a browser. She thought for a moment about who she could trust outside the Ashbourne circle, who had no connection to Adrian, no connection to the family business, no reason to be compromised. She typed a name into the search bar. A forensic accounting firm based in Chicago, small and specialist, with no existing Ashbourne relationship. Then a second name, a cybersecurity attorney who had been quoted in a financial crime case 3 years ago, someone she'd noted at the time purely on professional instinct. She stared at the screen. She thought about Harmon, Richard Harmon, who had held her hand at her mother's funeral, and she felt something move through her chest that was not quite grief and not quite rage, but lived in the narrow space between them. A thin, cold thing. The sensation of understanding that the betrayals don't come from strangers. They never do. She began composing an encrypted message. Her hands were steady. The clock on her desk read 1:14 in the morning. Outside, Manhattan moved in its usual sleepless rhythm, indifferent and enormous. She pressed send. And somewhere across the city, on the 44th floor of a building she did not yet know was at the center of everything, Adrian Vale loosened his tie and poured himself a drink and made a phone call. "She suspects nothing," he said. He was almost right. The encrypted message reached Marcus Webb at 1:47 in the morning Chicago time. He was still awake. He was always still awake at that hour. A habit built over 20 years of forensic accounting work that had long since colonized his sleep schedule and made it unrecognizable. He read the message twice, poured himself a second coffee he didn't need, and read it a third time. Then he picked up his phone and called the only number he called when something came in that made the back of his neck go cold. "I need you to run a name," he said when she answered. His partner, Dana Rice, had been in financial crime investigation for 16 years. She didn't ask why he was calling at 2 in the morning. "What name?" "Adrian Vale, New York, Finance." A pause. He could hear her already moving, the specific sound of her office chair, the click of a keyboard. "How deep?" "All the way," Webb said. He sat in the blue light of his monitor and waited, and thought about the woman who had sent the message. The controlled precision of it, the complete absence of panic, the specific and detailed nature of what she'd flagged. In his experience, people reaching out in genuine crisis either gave you too much information drowning in emotion or too little because they were too frightened to think clearly. This woman had given him exactly what he needed, organized in a way that told him she had been holding herself together through sheer structural will for hours already. He thought, whoever she is, she's been running on glass since tonight. Across the city she was trying to wreck. Celeste Ashbourne did not sleep. She changed out of the midnight blue gown in the dark of her bedroom, moving quietly out of some residual instinct she couldn't name, as though sound itself might give something away. And she hung it in the back of her closet behind other things, and she stood in her bathroom in a t-shirt and cotton pants and looked at herself in the mirror for a long time. She looked fine. That was the problem. She looked like herself, same dark eyes, same controlled expression, same face she'd worn to board meetings and funeral receptions and every difficult moment of her adult life. She looked like a woman who had her life organized. She turned the cold water on and pressed both wrists under it and stood there until she could feel her pulse again, which was something her therapist had taught her 3 years ago. After the stretch of weeks following her mother's death, when the numbness got so complete, she'd started cutting her palms with her thumbnail just to feel the pressure. She didn't do that anymore. The cold water was the substitute. She felt her pulse. She turned the water off. She went back to her study. Over the next 4 days, she rebuilt her entire understanding of her own life. Webb and Rice worked fast, faster than she'd expected, and what they sent her, piece by encrypted piece, was worse than anything she'd extrapolated from one overheard conversation. 3 shell corporations, all incorporated in Delaware, within 18 months of the beginning of her relationship with Adrian. Proxy voting arrangements buried in subsidiary documentation that, on paper, looked like standard investor protections. Legal amendments to the Ashbourne Group's internal governance framework that had been submitted and approved without ever crossing Celeste's desk, which meant someone inside the legal division had routed them specifically around her. Harmon. Every trail eventually bent back toward Harmon. She sat with that for an entire night before she could move past it. She sat at her desk and looked at his name in document after document, his signature, his authorization codes, his deliberate redirection of review processes, and she tried to reconcile the Richard Harmon in those files with the one who had held her hand at a graveside and told her that her mother had been the finest woman he'd ever known. She couldn't reconcile them. She stopped trying. She filed it in the same cold-locked place she'd put Adrian's smile. On the 5th day, she called her father. Thomas Ashbourne was staying at the family property in Connecticut. She'd sent him there under the guise of a needed rest after the gala's excitement, which Adrian had noted and accepted without suspicion. The call was on the private phone. She made it at 7 in the morning, standing at the kitchen window of her estate, watching the early light move across the back garden. Webb found 3 shells, she said when he picked up. All established inside the first 8 months. He had the architecture in place before the first time he told me he loved me. A long silence on her father's end. She could hear him breathing, deliberate, controlled breathing. The same technique she used, something the family apparently generated independently in moments of crisis. Richard, Thomas said finally, all of it runs through him. She paused. I need to know if you have any documentation of a coercion attempt. Anything. A threat, a phone call, something that would tell me when it started. There was an incident, her father said slowly. 4 years ago. Richard came to me. Said he'd received a blackmail attempt. Something about a financial irregularity from the early 90s before you were involved in the company. I told him to ignore it. We had attorneys deal with the threat. I thought it was resolved. Celeste closed her eyes. It wasn't resolved, she said. It was an audition. What? They tested him 4 years ago, saw how he reacted, what pressure points he responded to. Then they went quiet, and they waited. And 2 years ago, when they sent Adrian, Harmon was already prepared. She pressed her forehead briefly against the cool kitchen window glass. Dad, he didn't choose this, but he's been feeding them everything. Board schedules, legal review timelines, which version of what document gets seen by which attorney. Thomas Ashbourne was quiet for so long she thought the call had dropped. What do we do about Richard? He said. Nothing yet. She pushed back from the window. If we move on Harmon before we have the full picture, Adrian knows immediately that something's wrong. We let him keep running information. She heard her father start to object, and she cut through it, not unkindly but without space for argument. I know, Dad, but he's more valuable as an open channel right now than as an arrest. He betrayed this family. He was cornered, and he made a choice, and yes, he will answer for it. She let the words sit. But not yet. She called the wedding venue that afternoon. She told them she needed to discuss postponing the date due to a family health matter. She called the florist, the caterer, the string quartet agency. She used the word postponement carefully, never cancellation, never anything that would generate the kind of social circuit chatter that found its way back to the wrong people inside of 48 hours. Adrian called her 3 times that day. She answered all 3. She was warm, slightly distracted, mentioned the stress of some family estate matters and a minor issue with a supplier in the company's West Coast division. She let him be reassuring. She accepted the reassurance with the precise calibration of a woman who genuinely needed it. You sound tired, he said on the 3rd call. I'm tired. That part was real. She hadn't slept in going on 5 days except for short, hard drops into unconsciousness that lasted 2 or 3 hours and left her more exhausted than she'd been before. I think the gala finally caught up with me. Take the weekend, he said. I'll come over Saturday. We can just stay in. That sounds perfect, she said. She ended the call and sat very still for a moment, And then she went to the bathroom and ran her wrists under cold water until she could feel her pulse. On the 8th day, the media exploded. She hadn't seen it coming, which she should have. She knew that afterward, recognized the gap in her planning, the exhaustion-induced blind spot. Someone had leaked to page 6 and 3 financial trade publications simultaneously. Ashbourne Vale wedding in jeopardy, sources say. The stories were vague, postponed due to undisclosed family circumstances, speculation mounts. But they hit social media with the specific viral velocity of wealthy people having problems content, which had its own enormous appetite among people who simultaneously claimed to despise the wealthy. Her phone lit up like a switchboard. She silenced it. Adrian called. This time his voice had something different in it, a tightness under the smooth surface, something she might have missed 2 weeks ago. "What is this?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I don't know who leaked it. I'm handling the PR side." "Celeste." The tight thing in his voice pulled slightly closer to the surface. "If something is wrong, you come to me first. That's how this works." She noted the phrasing. "That's how this works. Not you can always talk to me or I want to be there for you." A procedural statement, a reminder of the operational structure. "Of course," she said. "Nothing is wrong, Adrian. A family health matter came up. I needed to move the venue date. Someone talked." "Which family health matter?" "My father's been tired. His cardiologist wants to run some tests." This was a lie she had prepared specifically for this conversation, detailed enough to be convincing, vague enough that it couldn't be verified quickly. "I didn't want to worry you." Silence. She counted the seconds. 1, 2, 3. "Why didn't you tell me?" he said. "Because I wanted to handle it before I scared you unnecessarily." She put the exact right amount of gentle frustration into her voice, the tone of a woman who feels slightly accused of something that doesn't deserve accusation. "Can we talk tonight? Properly? I need to get through this afternoon first." He agreed. He said he loved her. She said it back. She put the phone down and looked at the ceiling and thought, he's accelerating. She was right. Within 48 hours, the Ashbourne Group stock began experiencing unusual volatility. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would trigger regulatory scrutiny on its own, but a specific pattern of short positions and suppressed trading that Webb flagged within hours of its starting. "He's applying pressure," Webb told her on a call that evening. "Small enough to look like market noise, but it's coordinated. Whoever is managing the financial side of this operation has done it before, says this is not amateur hour. How long before it creates real instability? At this rate," Webb paused. 3 weeks before it starts affecting your credit lines. Maybe 4. 3 weeks. She still hadn't found the full scope of the proxy language amendments. She still didn't know who the older voice in the corridor had been. The architect, the man who had built the machine that Adrian was merely operating. She had a name gap at the center of everything, and every day she worked around it felt like working around a hole in the floor. She called her father again. "I need the Connecticut house fully staffed this week," she said. "Extra security, but don't use the regular contractor. Use Chen's firm." Marcus Chen ran private security for 3 of the largest financial families on the East Coast and had exactly zero relationship with anyone in the Ashbourne Group's existing network. "You think they're watching the property?" "I think Adrian is running out of patience and starting to make operational moves." She chose her next words carefully. "If his next step is what I think it might be, you're safer out of the city." Her father was quiet for a moment. "Celeste, how dangerous is this?" She thought about a flat, unhurried voice in a service corridor. "There are people who manage those situations." "I'm handling it," she said. She did not answer his question directly. She couldn't yet, without confirming the thing she was still hoping she'd misheard, the thing she hadn't allowed herself to fully name even in the privacy of her own skull, because naming it made it real in a way she wasn't ready for. On the 12th day, a man walked into the lobby of her building. She wasn't there. She was upstairs in the study, running through corporate filings with Rice on an encrypted video call. But her building's security desk called up to alert her that a visitor had arrived without appointment, had given his name, and had said only that she would know who he was. The security guard read her the name, and she sat for a moment with the phone against her ear, thinking about the specific geometry of coincidence, which she had never believed in. "Send him up," she said. She ended the call with rice. She closed the laptop. She stood up and straightened her shirt and walked out of the study and to the front door of the penthouse and stood there for the 60 seconds it took the elevator to arrive. The doors opened. Lucian Moretti was 43 years old, and he looked exactly like what he was, if you knew how to read it, and looked like absolutely nothing alarming if you didn't. Medium height, dark coloring, a stillness about him that had nothing to do with passivity. It was the stillness of something coiled, something that had learned long ago that motion was expensive and chosen its moments carefully. He wore an unremarkable dark coat. He had eyes that were almost black and that looked at you with a quality of attention she had experienced very rarely in her life. She had last seen him 11 years ago, at a university function in her final year, at a reception for international business students where he had been one of 3 graduate students presenting a paper on emerging market regulatory frameworks. She had argued with him for 45 minutes about antitrust theory while eating terrible canapes, and she had thought at the time that he was the most intellectually honest person she'd met in 3 years of university. He didn't argue to win, he argued to find out what was actually true, which was rarer than it should have been. She had not known then what he was. She knew now. Everyone in a certain sphere of financial and legal knowledge knew Lucian Moretti's name, even if they couldn't say it out loud in most company. "Celeste," he said. "Lucian." She stepped back from the doorway. "Come in." He came in. He looked around the penthouse once, not admiringly, not appraisingly, the way most people did. More the way a person checks a room for exits and angles out of a habit too old to be conscious. Then he looked back at her. "I won't take much of your time," he said. "Sit down." She moved toward the kitchen. "Coffee?" "Please." She made coffee because she needed something to do with her hands, and because offering hospitality was a thing she knew how to do on autopilot when the rest of her was occupied with something enormous. She heard him settle into a chair at the kitchen table. She brought 2 cups and sat across from him. He looked at her for a moment, the quality of attention again, not predatory, not clinical. Something else, like he was reading something that had been written carefully and was taking it seriously. "Who hurt you?" he said. She stared at him. No preamble, no social navigation. 4 words said quietly, and somehow the most disarming thing anyone had said to her in 12 days of conducting a covert investigation into the man she'd agreed to marry. She felt something shift in her chest. She held it very still. "Why are you here, Lucian?" "Because I've been watching Adrian Vale's operation for 8 months, he said. And 3 weeks ago his people ran a financial trace on the Ashbourne Group's secondary holding structure that matched a pattern I recognize. He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "I've seen that pattern before. The man who designed it is not someone who leaves loose ends." Celeste looked at him steadily. "You're telling me you know who's behind this. I'm telling you that what you found in a service corridor at the plaza is the visible 3% of something considerably larger." He met her eyes without flinching. "And I'm telling you that the people running this operation have killed before, more than once, and that the next target they've identified isn't you." She felt the blood leave her face. "My father," she said. Lucian didn't answer. He didn't need to. The steadiness of his expression told her everything, and something cold and absolute settled into the center of Celeste Ashbourne's chest. Something that rearranged itself there permanently, like a stone dropped into deep water, sinking until it hit the bottom, and the stone hit the bottom and stayed there. Celeste sat across from Lucian Moretti at her kitchen table, and she felt the specific, terrible clarity that comes not from understanding something new, but from having something confirmed that you had already known in the place where the body keeps its oldest knowledge, the gut, the sternum, the back of the throat. She had known, somewhere, since the service corridor. She had filed it under last resort and other options, and had let herself believe that those words meant something less absolute than they did. They didn't. "How certain are you?" she said. "Certain enough that I drove here myself instead of sending someone." Lucian's hands were still around the coffee cup. He hadn't moved since he sat down, and that stillness was starting to feel less like calm and more like the surface of something very deep. "The operation against your family runs through a man named Desmond Falk. He doesn't appear in any corporate filing, any board document, any public record connected to Adrian Vale. He runs 3 legitimate investment vehicles as cover, and underneath them a network that has been operating in major financial markets for over 15 years. Falk. She tested the name. It meant nothing to her, which was exactly the problem. I've never heard it. You wouldn't have. That's the engineering. Lucien looked at her steadily. Adrian is the instrument. Falk is the architect. He identifies targets, inherited wealth with governance vulnerabilities, family enterprises with succession complications, and he builds operations around them that can take 2, 3, sometimes 4 years to execute. He's patient. He's done this 6 times that I know of. 2 of those operations ended with the primary target dying in circumstances that were ruled accidental. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, Manhattan continued its indifferent noise. A car horn, something distant, the city's permanent ambient breath. 6 times, Celeste said. The Ashbourne Group is the largest target he's attempted. Lucien paused, and she noticed that he chose his words the way someone chooses steps crossing uncertain ground, deliberately, with weight. Which means the resources allocated are larger, and the contingency planning is more extensive. You said my father is the next target. Your father is the obstacle that needs to be removed before the proxy arrangement can be legally contested. Lucien finally lifted the coffee cup, took one measured sip, set it back down. With Thomas Ashbourne gone, control reverts structurally to the board's secondary governance framework, the one that's been quietly amended over the past 18 months to give Adrian's proxy vehicles the deciding vote in a contested succession. Celeste put both palms flat on the table. She needed to feel something solid. When? My intelligence puts it inside 10 days, possibly sooner if the media coverage around the postponement has made Falk nervous. He looked at her hands on the table and then back at her face. Your father cannot be in Connecticut. That property has been surveilled for at least 3 weeks. She was already reaching for the private phone. He put his hand over hers, not restraining, just stopping the motion for 1 second. Not from here, he said quietly. Not from any device connected to this building's network. They have coverage on your communications infrastructure. I don't know the full extent, but I know enough. We move your father tonight, and we do it without any electronic trail that could be traced back to a decision made in this apartment. She looked at his hand on hers for a moment. Then she looked at him. Why are you doing this? Because Desmond Falk destroyed a family I was trying to protect 8 months ago, and I wasn't fast enough. Something shifted in his expression. Brief, contained, but there. I won't be slow twice. She studied his face. She had learned, in the past 12 days, to read people the way she read financial documents, looking for what was absent as much as what was present, the gaps where information should have been and wasn't. She looked at Lucien Moretti and she found no performance, no angle she could identify, only the flat, undecorated truth of a man who had been too late before and intended not to be again. Okay, she said. She stood up. Tell me what you need. They moved her father that night. Lucien had a vehicle already outside, not registered to anything that connected to him directly, driven by a man who said nothing and needed nothing explained. Celeste called her father from a prepaid phone she bought from a bodega 3 blocks from her building, paying cash, and she said 4 words that they had established as a family code decades ago after a kidnapping threat against Celeste when she was 14. The gallery is closed. Her father said, How long do I have? 90 minutes, light bag only. Leave your personal phone in the house, turned on. The Connecticut property would continue to look occupied to anyone monitoring it remotely. Her father's phone pinging towers in the area, lights running on timers. His regular housekeeper maintaining her normal schedule without knowing why any of this was necessary. Thomas Ashbourne was moved to a property Lucien maintained under a corporate name that had no surface connection to him. A house in Westchester. Unremarkable. Secure. With 2 men already inside who moved through it with the quiet professionalism of people who did this work and did it well. Celeste watched her father walk through the front door of that house, and she watched him look back at her once before he went inside, and his face had the expression of a man who was frightened for his daughter, and had made the calculation that saying so would not help her right now. She drove back into the city with Lucien, and they didn't speak for the first 20 minutes of the drive, the silence between them not uncomfortable but weighted, Two people running separate internal processes in parallel, the way certain kinds of people do when the situation is too complex and too dangerous for easy conversation. Harmon, she said finally, I need to know everything he's passed. I've had that traced for 6 days, Lucy said. He was looking at the road. The full board schedule for the next quarter. Your father's medical history, including the cardiologist appointments, which tells me someone has been monitoring his calendar specifically. The secondary governance amendments I mentioned. And something else. She waited. Your forensic team in Chicago. He said it without accusation, but she felt the words land like something physical. They know about Webb and Rice. The car moved through traffic, city lights passing over the windshield. How long? She said. Based on the communication pattern I intercepted? 7 days. He glanced at her. 5 days after you made contact with them. 7 days. She had been running a covert investigation while Harmon fed its existence directly to the other side. Every file Webb had sent her, every conversation they'd had on what she'd believed was an encrypted channel, Harmon had known the outline of it, if not the specific content. They let me keep going, she said. Understanding arriving slowly, with the specific nausea of recognizing a trap from inside it. They knew I was investigating, and they let me keep going. Because watching you investigate tells them what you know and what you don't know. Lucian's voice was even. And because as long as you believe you're running a covert operation, you're predictable. You stay inside the parameters they've mapped. She pressed the back of her head against the car seat and stared at the ceiling of the vehicle. 12 days. 12 days of believing she was operating in the dark when she had been, in some essential way, exactly as visible as she'd been the night of the gala. More even, because she had been generating information actively, handing them a map of her own awareness. Webb and Rice, she said. They need to go dark immediately. No contact with you from any device or channel that's been used previously. He paused. I can have someone reach them within the hour. Do it. She closed her eyes for 3 seconds, let herself feel the full weight of it. Then she opened her eyes and sat up straight, because the weight was real, and it needed to be carried, not avoided. What do we still have that they don't know about? Your father's location, as of tonight. That channel is clean. He merged onto a different road, the city thickening around them. And one other thing. She waited again. Falk made a mistake 8 months ago, with the family I mentioned. He used a federal contractor to manage the elimination, someone who had worked through a regulatory subcommittee connected to the SEC's Financial Crimes Division. That contractor is currently in witness protection for an unrelated matter and has been cooperating with a federal investigation for 4 months. He stopped at a light. I've been building a relationship with the federal team running that investigation. What I have from Falk's previous operations, combined with what your forensic team has assembled on the Ashbourne side, is enough to bring in federal jurisdiction. Then why haven't you already? Because bringing in federal jurisdiction without complete documentation on the current operation means Falk burns everything and starts over somewhere else. The light changed. He drove. We need the full architecture, every shell, every amendment, every proxy arrangement, all of it documented and in federal hands simultaneously, or he walks. She thought about that, about the precision required, the timing. How long to build a complete case? 3 weeks, maybe 4. You said my father has 10 days, which is why the first priority is getting him somewhere Falk's contractors can't reach him. He pulled up outside her building, left the car running. Your father is safe tonight. That buys us time to build the rest. She didn't get out immediately. She sat with the shape of it, the full scope of what needed to happen and in what order and how many things could still go wrong. Lucian. She turned to look at him. The people Falk has used before, the contractors. How good are they? He looked back at her without softening it. Good enough that 2 previous operations looked like accidents. She nodded once, got out of the car, went inside. She did not sleep. She sat in her study at 3 a.m. with a legal pad and she wrote out everything, the complete architecture of the operation as she understood it, the gaps, the timeline, what Falk knew about her and what he might not. And she wrote it by hand, on paper, which could not be intercepted electronically, which was so analog as to be essentially invisible in the current landscape. She wrote Harmon's name and she stared at it for a long time. Then she made a decision. She called him the next morning at 7:45 when she knew he would be at his desk. 31 years of knowing his schedule had to be worth something. She called from her regular phone, the one that was monitored, because what she was about to do needed to be on the monitored channel. She needed this particular conversation to be heard. "Richard," she said when he answered, "I need to see you today. The prenuptial review. I have some questions about the third version." A pause, almost imperceptible. "Of course, Celeste. I can come to you this afternoon." 2:00, she said. "Here." She ended the call and sat very still, and then she pressed her wrists under cold water at the kitchen sink and felt her pulse hammering against her own fingers. She was going to confront Harmon, not because it would help the investigation. Lucienne had been clear that moving on Harmon prematurely was dangerous. She was going to confront him because she needed to look him in the face. She needed to hear it from him directly, needed to understand the full shape of the betrayal, the when and the why, and the exact mechanics of how a man who had held her hand at a graveside had decided to participate in a plan that included her father's murder as a contingency option. She needed it the way you sometimes need something that you know is going to hurt you, because not knowing hurts differently and worse. Harmon arrived at 2:00 precisely. He was 67 years old, compact and silver-haired, with the kind of careful professional composure that had served him through 4 decades of high-stakes legal work. He sat across from Celeste in the study, the same room where she'd been working for 12 days, and he accepted the coffee she offered, and he looked at her with what appeared to be his normal expression. Attentive, measured, mildly concerned in the way that senior advisors are mildly concerned when the people they advise are clearly under stress. She put a folder on the desk between them. She watched his eyes go to it. "I've been reviewing the prenuptial documentation," she said. Her voice was level. "I have some concerns about the third version specifically, the proxy language in section 14. Something happened in his face. It was so small she might have missed it if she hadn't been looking for it with the specific attention of someone who had spent 12 days thinking about almost nothing else. A tightening around the eyes. A fractional adjustment in how he was holding his jaw. There have been several versions in circulation," he said carefully. "It's not unusual in complex—" "Richard." She said his name the way her mother used to say it. Not unkindly, but with a completeness to it, a finality that stopped what was coming next. "Don't." He was quiet. 4 years ago, she said. The blackmail attempt. The financial irregularity from the 90s. She watched him. Was it Falk? The name landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Richard Harmon's face did something she had never seen it do in 31 years of knowing him. It collapsed. Not dramatically. There was no theatrics in it, no performance. It was more like watching a structure that had been bearing enormous weight for an enormous amount of time simply surrender to the accumulated pressure, all at once, quietly. His composure went out like a light, and what was underneath it was an old man who looked like he hadn't slept in 4 years. "Celeste," he said. His voice had changed entirely. No professional register left, nothing calibrated. Just raw and exhausted, and something that might have been relief and might have been grief and was probably both. "I need you to understand. Did they threaten your family?" Not a question. She already knew the answer. She needed him to say it. His jaw moved. "My granddaughter," he said. "She was 7 years old. The detail they included to prove they were serious." He stopped. His hands were shaking, she realized, slightly, but visibly. "I tried to find a way out. For 2 years I tried. There isn't one. Once Falk has you, there is no— You fed them my father's medical records." She kept her voice flat. Not because she wasn't feeling anything. She was feeling something enormous, a compound thing made of understanding and fury, and something painfully close to sorrow. But because she needed him in the conversation, not defending himself. His calendar, his cardiologist appointments. "I didn't know that was—" He stopped himself. His head dropped slightly. "I told myself I didn't know what they were going to use it for. I knew, and I have had to live with that every morning for 3 months." He looked up at her. His eyes were wet, which she had seen before, at a graveside, and now those tears read differently, and she wasn't sure which reading was the truth, and maybe both were. "I'm sorry, Celeste. I know that is worth nothing." "It's worth something," she said quietly. Not everything, but something. She leaned forward. Here's what it's worth. You're going to help me take him down. Not Adrian, Falk. And you are going to give me everything. Every communication, every channel, every meeting, everything you have given them, and everything they've communicated back to you. All of it, to a federal team, on record, with your cooperation documented. He stared at her. They will no longer have the capacity to kill anyone, she said. Not if we do this right and fast. She held his gaze. But I need everything, Richard. I need you to be more frightened of what happens if Falk succeeds than of what he threatened to do if you stopped cooperating. Because if he succeeds, my father is dead. This family is gone, and you will have spent 4 years of your life carrying something you will never put down. She paused. You're already carrying it. It's already that heavy. I can see it on you. His breath came out of him. Long, ragged, the breath of someone who has been holding it for a very long time. He nodded. She called Lucien the moment Harmon left, from a clean channel, on a device Harmon couldn't have flagged because she'd only acquired it that morning. He's in, she said. He's been maintaining logs of every communication. He was keeping them in case he ever needed protection. He has 8 months of direct contact records, channels, dates, content summaries. A beat of silence on Lucie's end that she had already learned to read as the sound of him recalibrating quickly. That's enough, he said. Combined with what the federal team already has, that's enough to move. How soon can we? Her phone buzzed. A notification on the monitored device, the one she'd left running in the other room. She crossed to it and looked at the screen and felt the blood leave her face for the second time in 24 hours. It was a message from an unknown number. No text. Just an image. A photograph. Her father. Standing outside the Westchester house, in the front garden, taken from a distance but clear enough. Time-stamped 40 minutes ago. She looked at the photograph and understood, completely and without any remaining room for doubt, that the 10 days Lucien had estimated were no longer operative. They already knew where her father was. Lucien was still on the line. She heard him say her name. They found him, she said. Her voice was very quiet. Lucien. They already found him. The silence that followed lasted exactly 2 seconds. And in those 2 seconds, she felt the entire architecture of the plan they had been building shift and crack under the weight of what it now needed to become. Not an investigation, not a careful assembly of evidence, not a controlled and deliberate dismantling of Desmond Falk's operation from the outside in. Something faster, something harder, something that would require her to step completely outside the boundaries of the person she had spent 29 years building herself to be, and become instead whoever she needed to be in order to make sure her father was still alive by morning. The next 4 minutes were the most important of Celeste Ashbourne's life, and she spent them moving. She didn't freeze. She didn't spiral. Something happened in her that she would not fully understand until much later. A kind of stripping away, every non-essential thing falling off like weight she'd been carrying without knowing it, and what remained underneath was something spare and very hard and completely focused. She crossed to the study closet while Lucien was still talking and pulled out the go-bag she had prepared 6 days ago at his instruction. Cash, 2 clean phones, documents, a change of clothes, and she had it over her shoulder before he finished his sentence. Talk to me, he said on the line. Photograph. Time-stamped 40 minutes ago. Front garden of the Westchester house, my father walking the perimeter. He does it every morning, same route. I told him to vary it, and he... She stopped. Breathed. He didn't vary it. I'm calling the house now on the secure line. She heard him already moving, the specific compressed sound of someone doing 3 things simultaneously. You need to leave your building, not the front entrance. Loading dock on the south side, the freight access. My car will be there in 8 minutes. Lucien, if they have a photograph from 40 minutes ago, then we have a window and we are going to use it. His voice had changed. Still controlled, but with an edge now. Something stripped back in him too. The same essential reduction she'd felt in herself. 8 minutes. South loading dock. Do not take the elevator. She took the stairs. 14 floors down through the building's service stairwell, concrete and industrial lighting, her footsteps loud in the hollow space. She counted the flights without thinking about it, the way you count things when your brain is doing something more important elsewhere. She was running scenarios. If they had the Westchester house under surveillance, they had had it long enough to establish a pattern. Her father's morning walk, the staff schedule, the entry and exit points. If they'd been surveilling it that long, the photograph wasn't a mistake or a show of capability made impulsively. It was a message. They'd sent it to her phone, the monitored one. They knew she'd made her father disappear. They knew she'd been working against them. And now they were showing her the photograph on the monitored channel, which meant they wanted her to know that they knew. They were compressing her, forcing a reaction. She hit the ground floor and pushed through the freight access door into the cold morning air of the service alley, and she saw the car already there, engine running, and Lucian in the front passenger seat and the same quiet driver from the night before behind the wheel. She got in. The car moved before the door fully closed. "My father," she said. "Spoke to him 30 seconds ago. He's inside." Lucian had a phone against his ear with one hand and was scrolling through something on a tablet with the other. "My men are moving him to the interior of the house and locking down. We have 4 people on that property. It's defensible for 6 to 8 hours if it comes to that, but it won't come to that." "How do you know?" Because Falk doesn't move in daylight on a populated residential street with no preparation time." He looked at her over his shoulder, brief and direct. The photograph was an operational message. He's telling you he knows where you are, where your father is, and that you're out of moves. He's expecting you to panic, to run to Adrian, to try to negotiate, to make a mistake he can use. She looked at the city moving past the window. He's going to be disappointed. Something shifted in Lucian's expression. Not quite a smile. Something quieter than that. He made a call. She heard him speak in low, rapid Italian. She caught maybe 1 word in 5, and then he ended it and turned fully in his seat to look at her. "I've moved the timeline with the federal team. They were planning a phased approach over 3 weeks. I've told them we're compressing to 48 hours or we lose the primary target." He paused. "They're not happy." "Are they moving?" "They're considering it." "That's not good enough." She met his eyes. "What do they need to move in 48 hours? Harmon's logs, live and authenticated, not copies. They need him on record, in person, confirming the chain of custody for every communication." He watched her face. "They need him today." She already had the clean phone out. She called Harmon's private cell, the one she knew about, not the one that would be monitored. He answered on the second ring and she said, "I need you to meet me in the next 2 hours, in person. Don't bring your personal phone. Come in a cab, pay cash, and tell no one." A silence. She heard him breathing. "Celeste, if they see me meeting you..." "Richard," she used the tone again. Her mother's tone, or something she'd built from the memory of it. "My father's life has a clock on it right now. I need you in a room with federal agents with your logs in the next 2 hours. After that, you are no longer my problem, and I am no longer yours. But right now, you are the only thing standing between Thomas Ashbourne and whatever Falk has scheduled." She waited 1 second. "Can you do this?" It wasn't a question either. "Yes," Harmon said. His voice was the voice of a man stepping off a ledge he'd been standing on for 4 years. "Tell me where." They used a federal field office conference room in Lower Manhattan that the lead investigator on Lucian's connected case, a woman named Special Agent Diane Kwan, compact and iron-spined with the specific exhausted sharpness of someone 12 months deep into a complex financial crime investigation, had cleared within the hour. Kwan shook Celeste's hand once, looked at her for exactly the amount of time it took to assess what she was dealing with, and then turned to the business of getting Harmon on record with the efficiency of someone who had been waiting for this particular piece for longer than she wanted to admit. Harmon sat at the conference table, and he opened his briefcase and he put 8 months of logs on the table, and he told Kwan everything. His voice steady in the way that things are steady when they've made peace with being said, when the holding back has cost more than the saying will. Celeste sat in the corner of the room, and she listened and she let herself feel, just briefly, the full weight of what Harmon had carried. Because it didn't excuse it. Nothing would excuse it. But she was her mother's daughter, and her mother had believed that understanding and forgiveness were different things, and that you could choose to do the first without doing the second. She understood. She hadn't decided yet about the second. Kwan worked through the logs with the methodical precision of a surgeon. She asked precise questions. She made precise notes. 40 minutes in, she looked up at Celeste and said, "You were right about the third prenuptial version. The proxy language would have given Vale's vehicles controlling interest in the Ashbourne Group's voting structure within 60 days of marriage." She said it flatly, without softening it. "It's sophisticated. I've seen 3 prior Falk operations. This is the most complete one I've encountered." Unskitsamaes. "You know Falk directly," Celeste said. "I know what he's left behind." Something moved across Kwan's face, brief and dark. 6 operations over 15 years. 2 of them ended with deaths that I cannot prove were his work, but that I know were his work. She looked back at the logs. "I've been trying to put him in a room for 4 years." "Then let's put him in a room," Celeste said. Kwan looked at her. "That's not how federal investigations—" "I'm aware of how federal investigations work." Celeste kept her voice level. "I'm also aware that you have a 48-hour window before either Falk's contractors make a move against my father or Falk himself burns the operation and disappears into whatever jurisdiction he runs to when things get complicated. So I'm asking you, what do you need from me to move in 48 hours? Kwan looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look that was doing real calculation behind it. "I need the financial documentation your team in Chicago assembled, authenticated originals." "Done." "I need live access to the Shell Corporation records, not copies, live access to the filing systems to capture current state documentation before anything can be altered. Webb can do that tonight, and I need Adrian Vale in a position where he does not know we're moving until we're moving." Kwan leaned back slightly. "Meaning someone needs to keep him engaged and believing the operation is proceeding normally for the next 36 hours. The room was quiet. Celeste said, "That's me." Lucien, who had been standing against the wall saying nothing for the past hour, turned his head to look at her. She felt his attention like something physical. "You'd be maintaining communication with him while we build the arrest package," Kwan said carefully. "If he suspects anything, he won't." She held Kwan's gaze. "He thinks he has me. He's been watching me run a compromised investigation for 12 days, and he believes I am a woman who is starting to crack under pressure and is about to come back to him looking for a way out." She paused. "So I'm going to give him exactly that." She called Adrian from the monitored phone. In the car on the way back across the city, while Lucien sat next to her saying nothing because he understood, she thought, what was necessary and what it cost. She called Adrian, and she let something real come through in her voice. The exhaustion, the fear, the fraying. Because all of those things were real, and she didn't have to manufacture them. She just had to redirect them into the shape of a woman who was about to break in the specific direction he was expecting. He answered on the first ring. "Celeste." "I need to see you," she said. She let the breath be audible. "I need to... There are things happening with my father's health and the company, and I need to see you, Adrian. I need to talk to you." A beat. She could feel him reading the call, doing his own assessment of what he was hearing. She let him read it. She gave him the surface he was looking for. "I'll come to you," he said, his voice warm immediately. The voice of a man who believed the thing he'd been waiting for was finally happening. "Tomorrow morning," she said. "Can you come tomorrow morning?" "I'll be there at 9. She ended the call. She looked straight ahead at the city through the windshield, and she did not let herself think about the 22 months, the laugh she'd believed was real, the specific ordinary intimacy of 2 years of a life she had now understood to be a construction. She didn't allow any of it because there was no room for it. Not yet. Not until this was finished. Lucien said quietly, "You okay?" "No," she said. Honest, brief. "Keep moving." The next 30 hours were the most precisely choreographed thing Celeste had ever been involved in, and she had spent her adult life inside a corporation where precision was the minimum standard. Webb and Rice worked through the night from a secure location Lucien established for them in New Jersey, live accessing the Shell Corporation filing systems and pulling authenticated documentation that Kwan's team could use for the arrest packages. Harmon spent 4 hours with 2 federal attorneys confirming every element of his logs. Lucien's intelligence network fed real-time location data on Falk's contractors. 3 men, all currently in the metropolitan area, none of them with legitimate documented reasons to be there. Kwan's team built the arrest packages. 16 people total across 4 states. Adrian, Three co-conspirators on the financial structure. Falk's two primary lieutenants. Falk himself, currently in a hotel in Midtown Manhattan that he'd checked into under a shell company's corporate account, and that Lucienne had identified 6 hours after the Westchester photograph appeared. And through all of it, Celeste Ashbourne slept for 3 hours on a cot in the Federal Field office break room and woke up at 5 in the morning and made herself coffee and sat with it and let herself feel, for those quiet minutes before everything began, exactly what was real. She was afraid, not of Adrian. She had moved past Adrian in some fundamental way the night she'd stood in the service corridor. She was afraid for her father. She was afraid of the specific contingency in Kwan's plan where things could still go wrong, where Falk could still burn everything and disappear, where the contractors could still move before the arrest teams were in position. She was afraid of who she was going to be on the other side of this. Whether the part of her that had spent 12 days building walls and filing things in cold, locked places was a temporary emergency construction or something permanent. Whether she would ever again trust the warmth in someone's laugh. She finished the coffee. She washed the cup. She went back to the conference room. At 8:45 in the morning, 14 federal arrest teams went into position simultaneously across Manhattan, New Jersey, and Connecticut. At 8:50, Kwan's team established covert coverage of the Ashbourne estate. 2 vehicles, plainclothes, with the instruction to hold position until Adrian Vale was inside the building and the signal was given. At 8:57, the perimeter team on the Westchester house confirmed. Falk's 3 contractors had moved into the street. They were 20 minutes from the property. Kwan looked at Celeste across the conference room. "We need to move now." "Then move," Celeste said. At 8:59, Celeste's private phone rang. Adrian calling to confirm he was 2 minutes away. She answered. "Good morning," she said, and her voice was completely steady and completely warm and completely the voice of a woman who was waiting for the man she needed. And she held that performance in place with everything she had. While outside her building, federal agents were moving into their final positions, and in Westchester a tactical team was boxing in 3 men who had come to kill her father. And somewhere in a Midtown hotel, Desmond Falk was probably drinking coffee in a bathrobe and reading the morning financial reports without any awareness that the perimeter of his entire life was closing around him from every direction at once. The elevator in her building opened at 9 o'clock exactly. Adrian Vale stepped out looking exactly like what he was, a man who believed he had won. The suit, the jaw, the warm and intimate smile that she had once thought was the realest thing about him. He crossed the lobby and she opened the door and he came to her and put his hands on her arms and looked at her face with an expression of such carefully engineered concern and tenderness that she understood, freshly, just how good he was. Just how long and how completely she had been read and played by someone who had treated the entire enterprise as a professional project. "Hey," he said softly, "talk to me." She looked at him. She held the warmth in her face for exactly the length of time it took her phone to buzz once in her pocket. The signal from Kwan. "All teams in position, waiting on your mark." She took a breath. She stepped back from his hands, and she watched Adrian Vale's face as she said, very quietly and very clearly, "It's over, Adrian." He went very still. The warmth left his face, not dramatically. It didn't collapse the way Harmon's had. It simply withdrew cleanly and completely, like a screen going dark, and what was left underneath was something she had never seen before because he had never needed to show it to her, something flat and cold and utterly without the performance of being human. "What did you say?" he said, barely above a whisper. The front door of the building opened behind him. 2 federal agents. Adrian turned and looked at them, and she watched him do the fastest calculation she had ever witnessed a person perform, his eyes moving, rapid and precise, assessing the lobby, the door, the agents, the distance, the exits. And she could see him arrive at the answer, the only answer, and she could see what it cost him to arrive there. He turned back to her. "You have no idea," he said, "what you've just done." "I know exactly what I've done," she said. He looked at her for one more second, and in that second something passed through his expression that she would think about afterward, in the quiet months of reconstruction that followed. Something that might have been the ghost of the person he performed for 22 months, or might have been the recognition that he had genuinely underestimated her, and was only now fully understanding the cost of that. And then the agents were at his arms, and the lobby filled with noise and motion, and Celeste Ashbourne stood in the center of it, completely still, her hands loose at her sides, her breathing measured and even, while the thing that had been dismantling her life for 2 years was finally, irrevocably, dismantled in return. Her phone rang. She looked at the screen. Lucienne. She answered. "Your father is safe," he said. "Contractors are in federal custody. Falk's hotel is surrounded." She pressed her free hand flat against the cool marble wall of the lobby, and she felt her pulse against her own palm, and she closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds, and she let herself feel it. The full, crushing, enormous weight of relief, which was not the opposite of fear, but something that lived on the other side of it, something you only reached by walking all the way through. "Lucienne," she said. "Yeah, tell me when Falk is in custody." Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "I want to hear it when it happens." "You'll be the first call," he said. She opened her eyes. The lobby was still full of motion. Agents, Adrian being walked toward the door, voices she wasn't fully tracking. She watched Adrian reach the entrance and she thought, 22 months. 2 years of mornings and dinners and the specific ordinary texture of a life that had never been real. Not one day of it, not 1 hour. She thought, "I survived you." She pushed off the wall and straightened her spine and walked toward the door because there was still work to do. Juan would need her. The federal process would need her. And somewhere across the city, a 64-year-old man who had taught her everything she knew about building things worth protecting was waiting for a phone call from his daughter telling him he was safe. She had just reached the door when her phone rang again. Unknown number. Different from the photograph number. She stopped. She answered. A voice she had never heard before. Older, flat, unhurried. The voice she had been building toward for 30 days without knowing what it sounded like until this moment. "Ms. Ashbourne," said Desmond Falk, "I think we should talk before this gets any further out of hand." Her hand tightened on the phone. She did not move. Around her, the lobby continued its controlled chaos, and outside the Manhattan morning went on in its enormous, indifferent way, and she stood absolutely still with Desmond Falk's voice in her ear and understood that this was not over, that it was in fact arriving now at the moment it had always been moving toward, the moment where everything either held or it didn't, where all the architecture she had built in 30 days of running on glass and cold water and 3 hours of sleep at a time either proved strong enough or it didn't. And she took one breath, slow and full, and she said, "I'm listening." She stood in the lobby with Desmond Falk's voice in her ear, and she did not move. Around her, 2 federal agents were still processing Adrian Vale near the entrance, hands secured, reading him his rights in the flat, recitative tone of people who have said those words so many times they've become structural, load-bearing, purely functional. Adrian's face was angled away from her. She couldn't see his expression, and she didn't need to. She was already somewhere else entirely, standing in the still center of the largest moment of her life, listening to the man who had engineered 30 years of other people's destruction speak to her in the unhurried voice of someone who had never once been told no by anything he couldn't eventually purchase or destroy. "I think you've made a significant error in judgment," Falk said. "And I think we both know that the federal case you believe you've assembled has several structural vulnerabilities that a competent defense will dismantle inside of 6 months. "That's an interesting opening," she said. "It's a realistic one." A pause. She could hear something ambient behind him. Interior sounds, a hotel room maybe, controlled climate, the specific acoustic texture of expensive insulation. "I've been through federal investigations before, Ms. Ashbourne. They're unpleasant, and they're slow, and they require a quality of documented evidence that is considerably more difficult to maintain through the full legal process than it is to assemble in the initial excitement of an arrest." "You're calling me from a hotel room that's surrounded," she said. "That seems like an unusual position from which to negotiate." A brief silence. "I'm calling you because you're the decision maker in this situation, not Agent Kwan, not your associate Moretti." Another pause. You've been the decision maker since the night of the gala, and I respect that. I'm speaking to you directly because I think you're the only person involved in this who is actually capable of understanding what I'm about to offer." She looked across the lobby at the morning light coming through the front glass. She thought about Kwan, who would have her monitored phone flagged and would be listening to this call within 45 seconds of its origin if she wasn't already. She thought about what Falk was doing. Not just what he was saying, but the operational logic underneath it. He was calling her because he was cornered, and because cornered was when men like Falk became most dangerous, and also, paradoxically, most honest, because the performance became expensive when survival was the immediate priority. "What are you offering?" she said. "Complete documentation of every Ashbourne governance vulnerability he identified and exploited, including 3 that your forensic team has not yet found." His voice remained level, almost conversational. "Names of every regulatory contact Adrian used for suppression. 4 of them are currently active in federal positions. And full cooperation on 2 prior operations, including evidentiary documentation of the deaths that Agent Kwan has been unable to prove for 4 years." She was quiet. "In exchange," Falk continued, "I would need assurance of a specific sentencing framework and relocation to a federal facility of my choosing. I'm 61 years old. I'm not asking to walk away. I'm asking to spend whatever time remains to me somewhere that isn't a maximum security block." She stood there, and she felt the full, complicated, dirty weight of it. Because the information he was describing was real, she could hear it in the specificity, and the 3 undiscovered vulnerabilities he mentioned landed with the particular resonance of something true, something that matched the gaps she and Webb had identified in the documentation but hadn't yet been able to close. He was offering her the complete picture. He was offering her Kwan's unsolvable cases. He was offering her, in exchange for a livable sentence, the kind of comprehensive resolution that federal investigations almost never achieved. And he was a man who had calmly ordered her father's death as a line item in a corporate strategy document. She said, "Hold on." She pulled the phone from her ear. She crossed to Kwan, who was just entering the lobby from the side entrance, already holding her own phone, already listening. She could see it in the agent's face, the focused attention of someone processing information in real time. "You heard," Celeste said. "Every word." Kwan's expression was controlled, but there was something underneath it. A tautness, a specific quality of wanting something she'd wanted for a long time, and being close enough to it now that the proximity was almost painful. The 2 deaths he's referencing, those families have been waiting 4 years for answers. If his cooperation gives us documented evidence, prosecutable evidence, what does his offer actually get him? Kwan chose her words carefully. Realistically, if his cooperation is as complete as he's suggesting, federal sentencing guidelines would support a negotiated framework. Minimum security, possible reduction of the maximum term. She looked at Celeste directly. He would serve time, real time, but not the same time he'd serve on a full conviction with an uncooperative posture. Celeste looked at the morning light through the glass. She thought about 2 families she didn't know, in cities she'd never been to, who had spent 4 years not knowing the exact truth of how they'd lost someone. She thought about the 3 undiscovered vulnerabilities in her family's governance structure, the ones she hadn't found yet, the ones that meant the Ashbourne group was still exposed in ways she couldn't see. She thought about what her mother would have said, which was not what she wanted to hear right now, which was probably why it came to her so clearly. Justice and revenge are not the same thing, Celeste. One of them leaves you with something to build on. She put the phone back to her ear. "Mr. Falk, Miss Ashbourne, you're going to come out of that hotel room and you're going to surrender to the federal agents outside it," she said. "And then you're going to spend the next several weeks in a federal facility giving Agent Kwan every single thing you just described, in complete detail and in writing. And you're going to do it fully and accurately because I'm going to have my forensic team cross-referencing every word you give her against the documentation we already have. And if there is a single omission or distortion, I will personally ensure that any sentencing negotiation is withdrawn." A pause. "And in exchange," he said, "in exchange, I won't spend the next 6 months ensuring that every journalist, every financial regulator, and every federal investigator with jurisdiction understands the full scope of what you've done in enough documented detail that even a reduced sentence becomes untenable." She said it without heat, without performance. "I'm not a prosecutor, Mr. Falk. I'm not interested in the pleasure of destroying you. I want the complete picture of what was done to my family's company, and I want the documentation that closes Agent Kwan's cases, and I want to know every person in a current federal position who helped you. That's what I want. You can keep your minimum security arrangement." Silence. Longer this time. She counted it. 8 seconds, 9, 10. All right, Desmond Falk said. And that was it. That was the sound of it. Not dramatic, not operatic, not the thunderclap resolution she had perhaps somewhere imagined during the 30 days of running on glass and cold water. Just 2 words from an old man in a hotel room who had spent 15 years building things designed to outlast his victims and had finally encountered something he couldn't outlast. She lowered the phone. She looked at Quan. "He's yours." Quan was already on her radio. Celeste walked out of the lobby into the Manhattan morning, and she stood on the sidewalk and she breathed the cold November air, and she let herself stand there without moving for exactly as long as she needed to, which turned out to be not very long at all, because she was exhausted in a way that went below muscle and bone into something structural, something that needed more than a morning on a sidewalk to address. Her phone buzzed. Lucien. She answered. "Falk is coming out," he said. She could hear it in his voice. Relief, controlled and compressed, but real. "His men at the hotel are standing down." "My father wants to talk to you." A brief silence, and then Thomas Ashbourne's voice. And she closed her eyes when she heard it because it was just her father's voice, just the ordinary sound of it. And for a moment that was the most significant thing in the world. "Celeste," he said. "Hey, Dad. Are you all right?" She thought about how to answer that. She thought about all the things that were true simultaneously. That she was not all right in the way that meant undamaged. That she was not all right in the way that meant unchanged. That she was all right in the way that meant standing, breathing, still capable of making decisions, still capable of caring about the right things. "I'm working on it," she said. He exhaled, long and slow, the same technique, the family technique. "Come to Westchester." "Tonight," she said. "I need to finish some things here first." She spent the next 4 hours with Quan, going through the arrest process and the documentation handoff and the preliminary framework of what Falk's cooperation would look like. Adrian Vale was processed at the federal building in Lower Manhattan, and she was not there for that, did not need to be. Quan kept her updated by text, the specific terse shorthand of someone managing multiple simultaneous processes. Vale processed. Counsel requested. Co-conspirators 1 to 3 in custody. Financial seizure orders executing. Webb and Rice drove down from New Jersey, and she sat with them in a conference room in the early afternoon, and they went through the 3 undiscovered governance vulnerabilities Falk had referenced, and all 3 were real, and all 3 had been sitting in the Ashbourne Group's secondary holding structure like slow-acting fractures in load-bearing walls, the kind of thing that might have taken years to manifest as crisis, but that would have manifested, eventually, in ways that would have been very difficult to trace back to their origin. She looked at the documentation and she thought, he was thorough. Whatever else Desmond Falk was, and he was many things, most of them irredeemable, he was thorough. He had understood the Ashbourne Group's structure better than half the people who worked inside it. That was going to change. She told Webb and Rice to take the rest of the week. She thanked them in the specific direct way of someone who means it without performance, looking at each of them, saying it once, clearly. Webb, who was not a demonstrative person, nodded once and said, "You did good work," which from him, she understood, was significant. She left the federal building at 3 in the afternoon and she walked for a while. Not toward anything specific, or just walked, the way you sometimes need to walk through a city you know well enough that the navigation is automatic and the rest of you can be somewhere else. Manhattan moved around her in its usual way, indifferent and enormous, and completely unconcerned with the specific dimensions of any individual life being reorganized within it, which she found, strangely, comforting. She walked past a flower stall and stopped and bought 3 things without really thinking about it. A bunch of something yellow, practical, and unromantic. And she stood on the sidewalk holding them and didn't entirely know why she'd bought them, and then she did know, and she flagged a cab. The cemetery was 40 minutes outside the city, and she hadn't been since her mother's birthday in March, and the grave was clean and well-maintained because she paid someone to ensure that, and she stood in front of the stone and looked at her mother's name, and she thought about what she wanted to say, and found she didn't have words, quite, for the specific shape of the past 30 days. So she put the yellow flowers against the stone, and she stood there for a while in the cold afternoon light, and she just let herself be a daughter who had survived something and was still not entirely sure how. She drove to Westchester. Her father was waiting at the door when the car pulled up, which meant he had been watching from the window. which meant he had been watching from the window for some time. He was wearing a coat she recognized from 20 years ago. Old, well-made, the kind of thing he refused to throw away on principle. He looked older than he had at the gala. He looked exactly like himself. She got out of the car and walked to him, and he put his arms around her. And they stood like that for a moment on the front step of the borrowed house in the cold November afternoon. And neither of them said anything, because there wasn't a version of language adequate to this particular moment, and they both knew it. "Come inside," he said finally. "It's cold." She went inside. They sat in the kitchen. It was always the kitchen, in every house. The kitchen was where the real conversations happened. And Thomas Ashbourne made tea because it was what he did when he didn't know what else to do with his hands. And they sat across from each other at a table that wasn't theirs. And Celeste wrapped both hands around the cup and let the warmth move into her fingers. "Harmon," her father said. "He cooperated fully." She looked at the cup. "Kwan's team has everything. He'll face charges. There's no way around that. But the cooperation will count for something in sentencing." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "I keep thinking about his granddaughter," he said. "She's 11 now." "I know." He made the wrong choices, every step. He wrapped his own hands around his cup. But they put a 7-year-old child in front of him as leverage. They did. She looked up at him. "That doesn't make it right, but it makes it human." Her father looked at her for a long moment. The dark eyes she'd inherited, the same careful assessment. "When did you get so much wiser than me?" "I learned from someone who wasn't bad at it," she said. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, briefly. That was enough. That was the whole conversation, in one gesture. The 30 days of terror and the 4 generations of work they'd protected, and the specific love between a father and a daughter that doesn't require elaboration because it is already the most understood thing between them. Lucien came by the house at 7 that evening. He knocked rather than calling ahead, which she had noticed was characteristic of him. He didn't occupy space before arriving in it. He accepted the tea Thomas offered, and he sat at the kitchen table, and he gave them both a complete account of the day's operational outcome in the precise, comprehensive way of someone who understands that people who have been through what they've been through deserve complete information delivered without unnecessary softening. 16 arrests total. The financial seizure orders were executing across 4 states. Falk had been formally processed, and his cooperation agreement was being drafted by federal attorneys who apparently could not entirely keep the satisfaction off their professional faces. The 2 prior cases, the 2 deaths that Kwan had been carrying for 4 years, had enough evidentiary documentation in Falk's cooperation to reopen them, and Kwan believed to prosecute. "And Adrian," Celeste said, "he's asked for a meeting with his attorney and declined to cooperate." Lucien set down his cup. "Which is his right and which won't matter, given the documentation your forensic team built. The federal case doesn't need his cooperation to succeed." She nodded. "He asked about you," Lucien said, "in processing. Whether you would agree to a meeting." She looked at her hands around the cup. She thought about 22 months. She thought about a warm laugh across a crowded room that she had spent that whole time believing was real. She thought about what it cost to believe in someone and what it cost not to, and she decided she was not going to spend very much more time thinking about Adrian Vale, because he had already taken 2 years of her life, and she was not inclined to give him additional real estate in the place where she kept the things that mattered. "No," she said. Simple, final. Lucien looked at her and nodded once, and that was the end of it. Thomas Ashbourne went to bed at 10, exhausted in the bone-deep way of a man who has been running on fear and adrenaline for days and has finally been given permission to stop. He shook Lucien's hand at the bottom of the stairs, and he held it for a moment longer than a handshake required, and he said, "Thank you," which Celeste knew her father did not say easily or emptily, and Lucien received it with a quiet nod that matched its weight exactly. She walked Lucien out to his car. The night was cold and very clear, the kind of suburban dark that felt different from the city. Actual dark. Stars visible. The sound of wind in bare November trees. They stood by the car. He didn't reach for the door immediately. "You should sleep," he said. "I'm aware." A pause. The wind moved through the trees above them. She looked up at it. The branches moving, the stars beyond them. The enormous, indifferent universe doing its thing at the exact pace it always did, regardless of what happened in the lives of the people standing underneath it. Lucienne, she looked back at him. Why did you really come to my building that day? The real answer. He was quiet for a moment, not evasive. She had learned to read the difference between his silences, which was a thing she had apparently done without fully noticing, the learning of someone in the specific granular detail of how they occupied quiet. I've known who you are for 11 years, he said. Not what you own or what you're worth. Who you are. He looked at her steadily, the night air between them. I didn't want to know, in 4 months or 6 months, that someone had destroyed that, and I was in a position to prevent it. She held his gaze. That's it? She said. That's it. She believed him. She believed him the way she had believed very few things in the past 30 days, which was to say with the specific quality of conviction that comes not from wanting something to be true, but from the accumulated evidence of someone's behavior over time under pressure. You learned who people were in a crisis. Lucienne Moretti had been exactly the same person at every moment of this crisis, not performing steadiness, not constructing reliability, just being those things without requiring acknowledgement for them. She said, "Good night, Lucienne." "Good night, Celeste." He got in the car. She watched the taillights go down the driveway, and then she stood in the cold for another minute, alone, listening to the trees. The trials took 8 months. She was not going to pretend they were anything other than what they were. 8 months of depositions and documentation review and the specific grinding relentlessness of federal prosecution, which moved with the velocity of something geological, immense and slow and ultimately irresistible. She sat through proceedings. She gave testimony twice. She answered questions with the same controlled precision she brought to everything else. And she felt, each time, the strange doubling of being both a participant in the process and someone watching herself participate from a small internal distance. The observer she'd become in the service corridor. The woman who had learned to keep her hands steady when everything else was moving. Adrian Vale was convicted on 11 counts: conspiracy to commit fraud, attempted corporate sabotage, wire fraud, conspiracy to commit murder, and 4 counts of financial crime she didn't bother memorizing because they were variations on the same fundamental thing. A man who had decided that other people's lives and legacies were resources to be extracted. He received 23 years. She heard this in a text from Kwan, and she sat with it for a moment, and then she made herself lunch, which seemed like the appropriate response to information she had been waiting for, and which, now that it had arrived, felt less like victory than like the closing of a door. Doors close differently than you expected. Not with force, just with finality. Desmond Falk received 17 years under his cooperation agreement. Kwan called her personally to deliver that news. And there was something in the agent's voice, a quality of completion, of something long carried finally set down, that Celeste recognized from the inside and received with the specific empathy of one exhausted person acknowledging another. The 2 families, Celeste said, the prior cases. Both prosecutions proceeding, Kwan said. We have what we need. A pause. You understand what that means. Those families will have answers. She understood what that meant. Richard Harmon pled guilty and received 30 months reduced for cooperation. She did not attend the sentencing. She wrote his granddaughter, now 12, a letter that she rewrote 4 times before she found the version that said what she meant without saying more than was right to say, which was that her grandfather had made serious mistakes, but had also, in the end, helped to make something right, and that both things were true simultaneously, and that understanding how 2 opposite truths could live in the same person was one of the more difficult and more important things a person could learn. She sealed the envelope and she mailed it, and she didn't expect a response. She got 1 8 weeks later, 4 lines in a child's handwriting. Thank you for writing to me. I think about this a lot. I hope you are okay. Sophie. She kept the letter in the drawer of her desk at the Ashbourne Group's offices. She looked at it sometimes when the rebuilding felt slow or heavy, which was a function of it being genuinely slow and heavy and also genuinely necessary. 2 things that were not in conflict. The Ashbourne Group spent the following year rebuilding its governance structure from the foundation. She hired 3 new board members. People she had vetted with a thoroughness that her former self might have found excessive, and that her current self understood was merely adequate. She installed a legal review system that required dual pathway authentication for any documentation affecting voting rights or corporate structure, which was expensive and time-consuming and completely non-negotiable. She promoted 2 people from inside the company who had been doing excellent work without enough recognition, and she let go of 4 people whose continued presence felt like a wound that needed air to heal. She did not make these decisions quickly. She made them carefully, with the specific patience of someone who had learned the cost of moving through the world, assuming that things were what they appeared to be. Her father came back to the office in March, 7 months after Westchester. He looked well, better than well. There was something in him that had recalibrated, some quality of presence that the crisis had either stripped away or restored. She couldn't entirely tell which. He sat in the quarterly board meeting and asked 3 questions that went directly to the structural issues no one else had been willing to raise. And afterward, Celeste caught his eye across the table, and something passed between them that didn't require words. She had lunch with Lucien on a Tuesday in April. They had been in contact through the trial period, occasional calls, a dinner in February at a restaurant in the West Village that they'd both approached as a practical meeting and that had ended somehow at midnight with neither of them having checked the time for several hours. He was careful with her, she noticed. Not fragile. He didn't treat her like something breakable, but deliberate, like someone who knew how to move around something he cared about without requiring it to rearrange itself on his behalf. She found this notable. She found herself thinking about it more than she expected. At the Tuesday lunch, he asked her about a company she was considering acquiring. He had some relevant intelligence on the target's regulatory history, which was ostensibly the reason for the lunch. And they talked about that for 20 minutes, and then talked about other things for considerably longer. And at the end of it, when they were standing outside the restaurant in the spring air, she said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer me honestly." "All right," he said. "Are you ever going to tell me that you've had feelings for me since the antitrust argument at university, or are you going to keep this up indefinitely?" He looked at her. Something moved across his face. The ghost of something, quickly controlled, and then a very small smile that was the most unguarded expression she'd seen from him. "I was planning to be subtle about it for at least another few months." "You've been subtle," she said. "I noticed. I'm choosing not to require the full schedule." He looked at her for a moment in the spring light. "That's efficient of you." "I'm a very efficient person," she said. There was a year between that April afternoon and the small ceremony in the garden of the Ashbourne family's Connecticut estate. The original property, not the borrowed house in Westchester, the one her grandmother had planted the roses in and her mother had walked through every morning and her father had sat in on summer evenings with a book he never quite finished. 14 people. Family and 4 friends. The ones who had earned the designation through the specific trial of being known and remaining. The morning was clear and cold. Early October, the garden in its best late-season state, roses still holding on, the maples going red at the edges, the light at that angle that happened for about 3 weeks every year and made everything look both exactly what it was and somehow more essential than usual. Celeste stood in the garden in a dress she had bought off a rack in a small shop in the West Village because she had walked past it and it had looked like itself, unperformative. And she had thought, yes. Her father walked her across the grass, and she looked at his face, and she thought about the gala, the chandelier light, and the champagne, and the 400 people, and the elaborate performance of a life that had never been real. And she looked at the 14 people in folding chairs on the lawn, and she thought, this is what real looks like. It turned out to be small. It turned out to fit in a garden. Lucien was waiting at the end of the grass, wearing a dark suit and the same quality of stillness she had first noticed in her lobby, which she had since learned was simply how he occupied the world. Fully present, nothing withheld, no performance between him and the moment he was standing in. He looked at her as she came toward him across the garden, and she looked at him and she thought about all the things she knew about him that took time to learn. The specific architecture of his silences. The way he asked one question when 10 would have been easier. The way he had never once made her feel like she needed to rearrange herself on his behalf. She thought about the service corridor at the plaza. The cold champagne. The moment she had stood against a wall with her heart slamming against her ribs and the world rearranged around her without permission. She thought everything that came after that moment was me choosing to survive it. Every single step. Her father put her hand in Lucian's and stepped back, and she looked at the man in front of her. Not what he was in the world's accounting, not his name or his history, or the particular territory he occupied in the complex geography of legitimate and illegitimate power, but who he was in the granular daily reality of being known by someone. And she felt something settle in her that had been unsettled for a very long time. Not completed, not healed exactly. She was not the same person she had been in that service corridor, and she was not the same person she had been before that night. And she was not going to pretend that what had been broken had been entirely rebuilt, because that was not how breaking and rebuilding worked. Some things you carried, some things you incorporated into the structure, became part of the load-bearing architecture, the thing that made you capable of supporting more weight than you would have been before. She knew things now that she had not known. About the specific nature of loyalty, which was not a feeling but a sustained choice made repeatedly under varying conditions. About the specific nature of betrayal, which was not always malice, and was sometimes fear, and was sometimes both, and was always expensive. About what she herself was capable of. The precision and the coldness, and the 3-hour sleep endurance, and the steadiness of her hands, and the fact that these capacities had always been in her, and had simply required a particular kind of pressure to reveal themselves. She knew that the greatest things she had protected were not the proxy voting arrangements, or the governance documentation, or the 4-generation legacy of the Ashbourne Group, though all of those mattered, and she had worked to protect all of them. The greatest things she had protected were smaller and less quantifiable: her father's life, her own capacity to trust, her ability to stand in a garden in October and look at a person she had chosen with full knowledge and no illusion and feel something that was real. That was the fortune. The one you couldn't put in a filing system or a corporate trust document. The one that could only be demonstrated by surviving the attempt to take it from you. The garden was quiet. The maple leaves moved in a small wind. Her father was watching from his chair with the expression she had seen on his face once or twice in her life, at her college graduation, at her mother's last good day. The expression of a man watching something he loves move into its own life, and understanding that this is what love is for. She looked at Lucian. He looked at her, and they began.